Hello, welcome to Wikipedia World Video. In the previous lesson, we mentioned one of the two main differences between the Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholicism. It is the turning away from Judaism, the religion of Jewish people, who were persecuted by the Roman Church during the Middle Ages and afterwards over the whole Europe and through the Middle East during the Crusades. The persecution did not stop even during the 20th century. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is a widespread ideology of the modern world as well. But why the Jews? Although this is more theological than historical question, so we will not discuss it in details, it is a historical fact that Jews were and still are the most hated and the most persecuted nation of the whole humankind history. World hatred towards Jews dates from the most ancient times. But the cruelest persecutor of Jews during the Middle Ages was the Roman Catholic Church, which was trying for centuries to either forcibly convert them to Catholicism or to exterminate them if not willing to cooperate. Almost all medieval Western European rulers did the very same thing, certainly under the guidance of Roman papacy. What were Jews doing in Europe in such great numbers anyway? Namely, after their country, Israel, was conquered by ancient Assyrian and Babylonian kings in the 6th century BC, they were scattered by Babylonians and Assyrians all over Asia and Europe. They had lived outside their homeland for more than 2,000 years, forced to travel and wander throughout foreign and often inhospitable countries. Eventually, many of them came to live in Western Europe. Those who lived in Spain were called the Sephardi Jews, while those who lived in Germany were called Ashkenazi Jews. These Jews who came to Europe were constantly persecuted by Roman Catholic Church, the same way the ancient Roman emperors persecuted Jews and Christians before that. Jews were not spared during the Crusades either. After the last 9th Crusade ended in the 3rd century, another Asian nation came to Europe. And they were not only passing by, and they were far away from the peacefulness of the Jewish people. They were the Mongols. Mongols came from Asia to Europe in the 13th century, conquering a vast part of Eastern Europe and attacking Central and South European settlements all the way to Adriatic Sea. They were a warlike nomadic tribe similar to Huns, Avars and Hungarians, who came to Europe from Asia and did the same things they did. Mongols formed a vast empire in those times, founded by their most famous ruler and conqueror, Temujin, or Genghis Khan. He and his successors in the coming decades of the 13th century formed the greatest world empire in humankind history, stretching from China in the east to Hungary in Europe, and from North Ocean to India and Arabia in the south. Mongols and their leader Genghis Khan were considered a scourge of God, as they were called, for the Western Europeans, just like the 5th century Huns and their leader Attila for the ancient Western Roman Empire. Huns were probably of the same origin as Mongols after all, and since Mongols appeared in Europe right after the Crusades, Muslims too considered Mongols to have been God's punishment for the crimes of European kings who were invading Arabian lands during the Crusades. In the beginning, Mongols were unstoppable. Their skills with horsemanship were unsurpassed, and the number of their armies and allies was extremely huge. It was actually a federation of various Mongol, Turkic, and other Asian tribes, similar to former Attila's Hunnish kingdom, which was comprised of various Asian and European tribes. However, As in the case of all other world-conquering nations, so did the Mongol Empire eventually collapse. Already at the end of the 13th century, the Mongol leaders and pretenders to the throne divided the empire into several parts. One of them was the Eastern European part of Mongol Empire, called the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde's power was diminished in the 15th century and then finally destroyed by Russians. Now we will go back to history of other European countries we did not mention and say a few words about them before we move on to the 14th and the 15th century, which is usually marked as the end of the so-called Middle Ages. Also, we will later talk about the medieval history of other non-European civilizations. Regarding Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, it was conquered by Muslims at the beginning of the 8th century, as we have already said. From 8th to 15th century, Muslims and Christians from Spain constantly waged wars. That period is usually designated as the Spanish Reconquista. Starting from the 8th century, the rebelled Christian rulers were liberating their countries one by one, until they drew away the last remnants of Muslims in 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus reached America. The truth is that most of Spain was liberated already in the 13th century, except for one region in south of Spain, which was still under the rule of Muslims. It was the Granada region. The most famous and most remembered national hero of Spain and Reconquista was the Castilian military leader called Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, who lived in the 11th century. He served the Spanish king Ferdinand I and Alfonso VI. Rodrigo Diaz is better known for his name El Cid. That is how Muslims called him. And the Muslims Spanish people were fighting against actually were North African tribes who accepted Islam during the Arabian conquest. They were known as Berbers, but Europeans called them Moors. Considering Reconquista, or the Spanish Crusades, it should be noted that papacy and Roman Catholicism were widely and sometimes fanatically supported by Spanish kings, as in the case of many other Western European nations that participated in the Crusades. The Spanish Inquisition was the most infamous religious and political institution of all Europe during the Middle Ages, and even of the world in later centuries. Now, regarding the history of England, or the history of the whole Great Britain, after the collapse of Western Roman Empire and the Great Migration period, it was colonized by Germanic tribes during the 6th and the 7th century. They were called Anglo-Saxons, after whom England was named. In the coming centuries, Normans or Vikings were also trying to colonize British islands. The final invasion occurred in the 11th century, when Normans defeated Anglo-Saxon kings and conquered their land. That event is known as Norman conquest of England. The decisive battle between Normans and Anglo-Saxons occurred in 1066, in the Battle of Hastings, when the Norman king William the Conqueror was victorious, eventually subduing all of England. William the Conqueror was actually a ruler of Normandy in France, which was named after them, and which was given to Normans by French kings in exchange for defending that area from other invading groups of Normans, that is, Vikings. Beginning from the next 12th century, England became a vassal state of the Holy Roman Empire and papacy. English kings of those times, from the Plantagenet dynasty, have been vassals of Rome until the 16th century, when English or the Anglican Church separated from the Roman Catholic Church. The greatest war in the medieval history of England and the whole of Europe was the so-called 100 Years' War, which started in the 14th century and which was fought between England and France. It was actually a series of wars between English and French dynasties over the lands and throne, since each of these sides pretended for the throne of their opponent's country due to their dynasty's relations and marriages. A similar thing occurred during the Norman conquest of England in the 11th century. The Normans, or the Anglo-Normans, who ruled both Normandy in France and England from the 11th century, wanted to rule over the French territories as well, after French kings took the Normandy region back to their kingdom. It was one of the causes of the 100 Years' War. This war lasted from 1337 until 1453, the year which was once considered as the ending date of the Middle Ages period. During the 100 Years' War, European kings realized that the regular army formations and battle tactics were no longer effective. Unlike French and other continental Europeans, the English kings abandoned the Knight Codex and honorable ways of waging battles, and started implementing the modern-day war tactics, which is, destroy as many enemies as you can. Although such a destructive and inhumane tactics, and even massacres of innocent people, were not rare during the Middle Ages and before that period, as we have said concerning the Crusades, nevertheless, many people of those times retained their so-called knight code and morality. The medieval knight remained a symbol of honor, courage, and piety till this day. Moreover, the bloodiest wars, massacres, genocides, and conflicts for world domination were much more frequent in the 20th century than during the Middle Ages, or any earlier period of humankind history. It is an egocentric misconception that the modern age is a peaceful period of freedom, tolerance, and civilization, while all earlier periods of history allegedly were times of great wars and turmoil. That is simply not true. After the 100 Years' War, all English or British possessions in continental Europe were seized by French kings, except for one fortress on the northwestern French coast, and the English kings possessed just the British islands from then on. One of the most famous and decisive battles during the 100 Years' War, to name one, was the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, when English King Henry V defeated the French King Charles V. Not long after that battle, a girl appeared in France claiming she had visions of God himself about the future French victory in the war. She was perhaps one of the most famous warriors and heroines of the French history. It was Joan of Arc. However, although she did help the French army defeat the English soldiers in more than one occasion, she was eventually caught by the enemy, Burgundians in this case, and sent to English king as war prisoner, where she was sentenced to death and executed by burning. The king she served was the French king Charles VII, or Charles the Victorious, who finally defeated the English armies and liberated France. He was from the French dynasty of Valois, which ruled France from the 14th until the 16th century, succeeding the former dynasty of Capet, or the Capetian dynasty, which ruled from the 10th until the 14th century. Its founder was Hugh Capet, who succeeded the last king of the Frankish Carolingian dynasty, Louis V, who had no children and immediate successors. During the 14th and the 15th century, that is, during the 100 Years' War, while French, English, Spanish, and other Western European kingdoms were busy waging wars over each other's territories, another invading Asian tribe came to Europe from Asia Minor. It was the Turks. They invaded Balkan and eventually conquered all southeastern European territories, threatening to conquer the whole continent of Europe, just like Arabs before them in the 8th century. Turks were yet another candidate for reaching world domination and forming a new world empire, thus replacing the former Roman Empire, both Western and Eastern. Turks conquered the Eastern Roman Empire, or the so-called Byzantine Empire, in the 15th century. It was the final demise of Constantinople. The Western Europe and the Roman popes were happy to see its demise, but were also worried about the Turks who wanted to invade even the Western Europe. Roman popes were sending more and more crusaders to the east to prevent the invasion of Turks, but it was all in vain. The Roman Catholic Church even offered an alliance to all the Orthodox Christian southeastern European rulers, including the Eastern Roman emperors, before their fall. However, it was only during the time of danger from the common enemy, as previously explained. Roman popes also offered a reunification of Catholic and Orthodox Church, since Christianity split up back in the 11th century. But again, it was all just a trick to occupy the East and restore the ancient Roman Empire. Turks, however, destroyed their dreams and began forming their own new world empire. The Orthodox Christians found themselves in a troublesome position to choose between two enemies, the Western Europe under the guidance of Roman Church and the Asian tribe of Turks. By the end of the 15th century, the Turks subdued all the lands of Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbs, Croats and Hungarians. Certainly, before they accomplished that task, all these nations offered resistance for some time, especially the Serbian people. We will say more about Turks and Serbian and other nations' resistance during that time in our next lesson. Thank you for watching Edupedia World Video.